You, I think, have had a little to say about Black Lives Matters recently. Many middle-class people lined up with an organisation that was avowedly Marxist until it became well known. It had on its website that it was committed to the destruction of the nuclear family. That it was a pretty interesting group. Now, they capitalised on an awful event to justify some pretty extreme activities, and a lot of people were too afraid to say this is not a good idea. You know, you had to appear to be supporting Black Lives Matters, and the defunding of police in the United States appears to have gone very badly. I think you've said a bit about this recently, that we can look back on it. It should feed into that narrative that people are a bit suspicious of some of the movements that they're being talked into, or that people are trying to persuade them to back.
Yeah, we just had an interesting study in the social sciences, which has found that it looked at areas that had experienced BLM protests, and it found that essentially there was a sort of mass withdrawal of policing in the aftermath of those protests. And on the one hand, as you'd imagine, that led to a fall in murders and deaths at the hands of police. There was much less police activity. But what it also did is it led to a very sharp increase in crime. So the murder rate increased by 11%, which resulted in about 3,000 additional deaths that would not have happened had routine, normal policing been maintained. Much fewer
arrests. Can you just repeat that for the emphasis? Can you just repeat that? So you've had how many extra Americans?
Yeah, in the aftermath of the BLM protests, there was an 11% increase in the murder rate, which was equivalent to 3,000 lives lost. So essentially the same number as 9/11. And this is, I find that a very troubling fact that we should be debating and discussing. There was also, by the way, in that study, it points out, John, in the aftermath of the BLM protests, voluntary redundancies among police officers increased by nearly 300%. So you saw a kind of collapse of morale among police, who clearly felt that the narrative around BLM was not an accurate one, but who also then decided that certain crimes and things, simply would not be attended to in the same way that they would normally. So arrests at property crime plummeted, arrests at other crime scenes plummeted, and murders soared. So we all had this curious moment where we were watching the protests during COVID, on the one hand being told to stay at home, on the other hand being told that protests were acceptable. But we can now see what the real world impact of that really was, which is why African Americans and Latino Hispanic voters have consistently been the most strongly opposed to ideas like defund the police, because they are the first people to experience elevated crime. And it's another example of a luxury belief. This idea that Rob Henderson at Cambridge has talked about, that the elite will often push luxury beliefs that bring no cost to them, which bring them status from other elites, but which impose very high costs on other people. Defunding the police is a classic example of that. And only a couple of weeks ago, one of the leading advocates of that idea was herself attacked in the street, and she promptly hit social media to say, where were the police? Where was the, law and order? And it became a symbol online of this deep hypocrisy that runs through the new elite. But you could also point at the things we've discussed, the constant push for mass immigration. It's not going to be the new elite who deal with the consequences of that. The constant push for more deregulation, more globalization, more prioritizing the interests of big business. It's not going to be the new elite who will suffer the consequences of that. It's going to be the working class. It's going to be non-graduates in the towns outside of the cities. The constant push for gender identity, the constant push for denigrating the nation. It's not going to be the new elite who worry about that. They don't get their sense of status and belonging from the nation. They get it from their achieved identities, from their education, from their professional success. It's going to be the working class plumber and electrician who really does care about the nation, who sees that his membership or her membership of the nation as a really important part of who they are. And so, you can go through the policy areas And as this ruling class drifts further and further away, they are increasingly pushing ideas that I think are disastrous for everybody else, but which they won't ever really feel the consequence of.